A good day to you. I do hope your journey here was a safe one. Yes. And I welcome you. I welcome you to the Adams farm. I am Mrs. Adams, the mistress of this little bit of paradise. Well, at least I see it as a bit of paradise. Oh, that I could say the same for Mr. Adams. Ever since his loss of the presidency to Mr. Jefferson in the year 1800, Mr. Adams has been a most desolate and depressed man. That is not the Mr. Adams I have known for more than 40 years. I have lived most of my life in this little corner of Massachusetts. I was born not far from here, in Weymouth, Massachusetts. I was welcomed into the world on November 22nd, 1744, into the home of the Reverend William Smith and his good wife, Elizabeth. I was one of 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. My parents were peculiar. Peculiar in the sense that they insisted that all of their children be educated, including the daughters. That in itself was a revolutionary idea. For even today, many feel that a mere woman need not know how to read, write, and cipher. But I was encouraged to read everything in my father's library and in the library of my grandfather Quincy. By the time I was in my early teens, I had mastered the classics in both Latin and Greek. And I hungered for more. I first met the newly minted lawyer from Harvard, Mr. John Adams, when I was but 15 years old. Mr. Adams had come to my father's farm on some legal business. Apparently, Mr. Adams was not much impressed with Miss Abigail Smith. He told my parents he could never have any affection for someone who was so bold, so frank, so outspoken. He was more interested in my sister Mary. I did not see Mr. Adams for another 2 years. He was off cultivating his legal practice. He returned to my father's farm again on some legal business. Apparently, in that 2 intervening years, I had undergone a miraculous transformation. For Mr. John Adams was indeed interested in Miss Abigail Smith. He told my parents he admired my intellect, my quick wit. I was hoping he admired much more. We began to court when I was 17 years old. Mr. Adams is 9 years my senior. Again, for the next 2 years, I would rarely see him. But oh, how we wrote letters. Little did I know these letters would be my lifeline. Few people realize what a passionate man Mr. Adams can be. My dearest friend, here I say I have amused myself in reading and thinking of my absent friend, sometimes with pain, sometimes with pleasure. always anticipating the next joyful and happy meeting, whilst my heart will be bound to yours, and with the purest affection I shall hold you to my bosom until we dissolve as one. He would also write letters reprimanding my behavior. He would correct the way I walked, the way I talked, the way I ate, the way I sat. He said that a lady should not sit with her limbs so crossed. It was unseemly. I wrote back to Mr. Adams, "My dearest devoted friend, a true gentleman would not be interested in the position of a lady's legs." He married me anyway. We married October 28th of 1764, just weeks before my 20th birthday. And then we came here to the Adams farm. You see, Mr. Adams had acquired the farm upon the death of his father. His mother lived in the larger house, we here in the smaller. John practiced law in this very room. We had these windows placed to facilitate John's law work, and the additional door for the convenience of his clients. Oh, how I cherish those early days. So often, I would come down here in the afternoon to take tea with John, and sometimes he would seek me out on the farm, and we would have a quiet moment together. And then the children began to arrive. We would have 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. Sadly, time has already taken 3 of my darlings from me, and I fear for the life of another. Our first child, our daughter, was born on July 1st, 1765. Mr. Adams insisted that the child be named after her mother, Abigail. I thought that there would be confusion with 2 Abigails romping about on the farm. But Mr. Adams explained the child would be known as Nabby, and I would become Mrs. Nabby. Oh, John was so restless in those days. His mind constantly churned with grand ideas of liberty, brotherhood, democracy. Why, every Thursday evening, John would meet with a like-minded group of young men to discuss these lofty ideals. Oh, they would meet at one another's homes, in barns, even in an open field, always to extol these virtues. And oh, those meetings in fields and barns, they would evolve into the Congress of the United States. And oh, how these young men wrote essays and letters extolling these virtues. Those letters, those essays would become the basis of the Constitution of the United States, a nation never before seen in the world before. John's meetings began to take him further and further afield, to Boston, to Philadelphia, to New York. But always, how we would write letters. Oh, how my heart would leap with joy when I would see John coming home upon the road, and how it would break with sadness when the time of parting came, and I would write another letter. My dearest devoted friend, you have forgotten something here at the Adams farm. You have left a piece of your heart here. My dearest devoted friend, We are to be parents again. Oh, John would write to me upon the organization of this Continental Congress. The negotiations with Britain were not going well. He wrote about the constant infighting among the members, always closing his letter with that final plea: please send cash. I had little cash to give. The crops of the previous year had been poor. I had a house full of children to feed. I wrote back to Mr. Adams, my dearest devoted friend, the tax collector was here yesterday. He was not particularly amused that you were at the Continental Congress. He wants his money. May I remind you, dear sir, Mrs. Adams is in need of cash. Oh, well, John would continue to write to me about all of the difficulties. Things were not going well. It seemed as though a final break with Great Britain would be the only resolution. Well, that break would come. John would continue to write his letters, always closing it with that final plea: please send cash. And I again would remind him I had none to give. Sadly, the situation had gotten to the point where a break was inevitable. A continental army was organized. Oh, it was an army in only the vaguest sense of the word. It was a collection of men, bakers, physicians, lawyers, as John was, ill-prepared, ill-trained, ill-equipped, some of them without shoes. And at the head of this continental army would be placed a former British officer, a planter from Virginia, the General George Washington. No matter how badly trained, how ill-equipped, or shoeless, these men would follow General Washington wherever he led. John continued to write to me about the difficulties within the Congress, the difficulties within the army, the constant infighting among the officers. He asked again, please send cash. And I again reminded him I had given up all of my silver spoons. I refused to give up my silver locket, a gift from John upon our wedding day. But nonetheless, he would continue to ask for cash. And I would continue to remind him, perhaps, sir, you could simply eat less. One afternoon, the children and I were preparing to sit down to our meal. We heard, in the far distance, we heard shouting and what sounded like the blast of a musket. We ran out of doors, and in the distance, upon an adjacent hill, we could see vaguely men mounting cannons upon the hill. We could hear the shrieks of the horses, the shouts of the men, the blast of the musket. We stood there, transfixed to the sight. I looked down into the face of my 9-year-old son, John Quincy. His eyes were filled with tears, his face contorted in terror. I thought, the revolution has indeed come home. If we do not win this revolution, John will surely be hanged, and the children and myself would be transported on a prison ship. if we survived at all. No, we must win this revolution at all cost. It would be many weeks before I learned that what the children and I had witnessed that day would forever be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. In truth, it was the Battle of Breed's Hill. And in that battle would be lost a dear friend and comrade, the Reverend Dr. Joseph Warren. 35 years of age, he had become a martyr to the revolution. No, we must win this revolution at all cost. I wrote to John about a rumor I had heard. My dearest devoted friend, I have heard a rumor that there is a yellow fever epidemic in Boston town. I fear for the lives of the children and for myself. Mr. Adams wrote back. His advice, stay out of Boston, and please send cash. The next letter that I would write to my dearest friend was one filled with sadness and grief. My dearest devoted friend, last evening, our little daughter, Susanna, aged 13 months, died. She could not withstand the ravages of the yellow fever. We have buried her in the churchyard behind my father's house. Oh, my dearest friend, please come home to me. I cannot withstand this burden. I need you. Oh, John, please come home to me. John would write back to me, my dearest devoted friend, I read of our recent loss. I can scarcely recall the smiles and graces of this little one, but I know I loved her just as much as the others who dance at your feet. My dearest friend, I cannot attend you at this time at the farm. Things are at a crucial point here in the Congress. There are great difficulties within the army. I know that you are strong. I know that you can bear this burden. Your dearest devoted friend, Mr. Adams. Well, John would continue to write to me about all of the difficulties. I wrote to him concerning the issue of independence. My dearest friend, I long to hear that you have indeed declared an independency from Great Britain. And in this new code of laws that I suppose you must make, I desire that you remember the ladies. Be more generous and favorable to them than their ancestors have been. Do not put absolute power into the hands of husbands, for all men are traitors. And all men are tyrants. If you wish your life and your household to be a happy one, you will remember the ladies. Oh, John did answer my letter. My dearest devoted friend, it is not convenient in the Congress at this time that we remember the ladies. I am sure that in some distant point in the future, this issue might be taken up. Please send cash. Oh, but that golden day would dawn. Independence had been declared. John sent me a copy of the document. He said that the 4th of July would forever be celebrated with flag-waving, parades, and fireworks. Oh, what a magnificent document. Oh, Mr. Jefferson, so elegant, so eloquent. Oh, I would write back to John concerning this independency. My dearest friend, I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies. You have proclaimed peace and goodwill to all men. You have emancipated entire nations, but you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. You must remember that this power is arbitrary and brittle and very likely broken. If you do not remember the ladies shall foment a rebellion that not even your George Washington can put down. Oh, he would answer my letter. My dearest devoted friend, it is not convenient at this time that the issues of the ladies be addressed. Please send cash. And John would write to me about that dreadful winter at Valley Forge. Those sick, starving, frozen men. The General George Washington knelt in the bloody footprints of his men. The Lady Washington, she was so kind and generous. She would brave the winter roads, traveling to wherever the general was encamped. She brought cartload upon cartload of food, medicine, clothing for those starving men. She herself knelt and bandaged those bleeding feet. I could not encamp along the army. I had a house full of children to look after. I had a farm to mind. I could not contribute in this way. Well, John would continue to write these letters, always asking for cash. I wrote to him after one of his visits to the farm. I told him that this latest confinement has been most difficult for me. There are times when I cannot rise from my bed. I suffered nausea, seizures. I feared so greatly for the life of this unborn child and for my own life. Just recently, I sat at the bedside of my dear sister, Mary Cranch, as she died after giving birth to her 9th child. I feared so greatly for this child and for myself. I begged John to come home. He wrote back to me that he could not attend me here at the farm. The situation would not allow his absence again. His advice: I believe that you are not the first woman to give birth. I doubt that you will be the last. I know that you are strong and will bear this burden. Please send cash. Again, I would write a letter with a heavy heart. My dearest devoted friend, I take pen to paper. I can scarcely lift this pen. Last evening I was delivered of a baby daughter. I named her Elizabeth after my mother. The child was stillborn. We buried her in the churchyard behind my father's house. Oh, John, have you no sentiment? Have you no heart? I need you. I cannot bear this great burden of grief alone. The public does not understand. My children are fatherless, and they do not care. Oh, John, please come home. I need you. Your dearest devoted, Mrs. Nabby. John would write back to me. My dearest devoted friend, I am not without sentiment, without heart. I did not know this little one who spent such a short time upon this earth, but I know she was dear to me. I have never looked upon her face, and yet I can trace that face within my mind. I cannot come home to you at this time. Things are again at a crucial point. I believe we are nearing the end of this dreadful war. Please take care, my dearest friend. Your dearest and most devoted, Mr. Adams. Well, John was indeed correct. The end of that dreadful war was surely on the horizon. Yorktown, 1783, the British surrendered. Their supply lines had simply become too long. They had become embroiled with the French in Canada. But they had surrendered. We had won the revolution. Oh, there was so much to do, an entire government to be organized, a code of laws to be outlined. But all that I could think of was that my dearest, devoted Mr. Adams would return here to the place of my greatest joy, the Adams farm. He was only here at the farm perhaps 2 or 3 days when I came upon him one morning. He was packing a large trunk, sorting his books and papers. I inquired of the gentleman, "Sir, do you anticipate a journey?" He replied, "Yes, madam. I leave tomorrow morning. I have been appointed as an ambassador to the French court to do what I do best, ask for money." The next morning, I stood on that dock and I watched as that ship went out of sight. For you see, Mr. Adams had taken a piece of my heart with him. He had taken my oldest son, John Quincy, to act as his secretary in Paris. Letters upon the ocean are very few. I heard very little from John for the next 3 years. And then a gentleman was passing through. He held a letter from John. He had met John in Paris. Mr. Adams had booked passage on a ship to France for myself and the other children. We were to join John in France. I did not know what to make of it. I had never been far from this farm, much less a ship upon the ocean. I did not know what I would need for such a journey. My first task aboard the ship was to scrub it thoroughly. It was quite filthy. Oh, the next 14 days, the seas were so rough. We tossed about. We lolled about on the deck like beached halibut. And the next 6 weeks proved no kinder. But then finally, we spied solid land, France. And when I stepped upon that terra firma, I looked out, and there I saw my Mr. Adams. And standing beside him was a young man I hardly recognized. Why, John Quincy had grown into a very handsome young man. Oh, Paris! I had never seen such a city. Why, carriages rolled down the streets at all hours of the day and night. There were vendors on every corner selling all manner of goods from all over the world. I have never been a lady of fashion, but I could not resist this embroidery upon this shawl. I've never actually worn it, but I do admire the embroidery. So it is all the way from Spain. Oh, the ladies of Paris. Oh, they dress so elegantly, but they wear very little. There are times when I think that you can see right through to their collarbones, and I know John enjoys that very much. Why, they prance around the streets like nursing mothers, as though nature has not given them enough to be proud of. And oh, while we were in Paris, Mr. Jefferson stayed with us. Oh, what a delightful dinner companion. He taught the children French and continental manners. He taught me all about wine. I did not know that one has one type of wine with mutton or beef, and another with fish or fowl, and still others with sweets. Oh, what a delight. And Mr. Jefferson, he knew everyone in the city of Paris. He knew of a very important lady by the name of Madame Debussy. She had a villa just outside the city gate. And every Wednesday evening, Madame Debussy would hold a salon at her villa. She invited the best minds of government, of medicine, of the church. Mr. Jefferson acquired invitations for myself and Mr. Adams. We entered this beautiful gilt room. Persons stood all around wearing peculiar clothing, speaking languages that I did not understand, one speaking French, another German, another Polish. And we waited for the grand lady to enter the room. The door swung open. A very elderly woman wearing a bright orange silk gown entered the room. She had very large, drooping breasts that she insisted upon displaying to the entire room. Her fingers were covered with jewels of all hue, and under her arm she carried a small white dog. She spun around the room, greeting her guests in this myriad of languages, and then she seated herself in the center of the room on a fine damask chaise. She placed the little dog on the floor. He proceeded to make a puddle. The grand lady took up her skirts and wiped up the puddle. And then she gave me her hand to go into dinner. I did not eat very well in Paris, but our days in Paris would come to an end. Mr. Adams was to be sent as a consul to the court of St. James, to the very king he had defied. We had a small house just outside of London. Oh, in London, again, people bustling about at all hours of the day and night. But I found the city very dirty. But one day, John received a letter from the palace. The following day, John was to be presented to the king himself. I had nothing to wear. I could not be presented to a monarch wearing the wools and linens of a farmer. I found a very reputable dressmaker in London town. She was able to alter a beautiful seafoam green gown. I purchased a large hat with white and blue feathers. Oh, I thought myself quite fashionable. The next morning, John and I were taken by an elegant carriage to the palace. We alighted at the bottom of wide, white marble stairs. A finely dressed gentleman carrying a large golden staff accompanied us into the palace. He took us into a long, narrow room with chairs on either side, persons milled about waiting for the king's audience. There we stood for 2 hours. The man with the golden staff entered and bade us be seated. And there we sat for another 2 hours. And another 2 hours. And then the door swung open. The beautifully dressed gentleman with the golden staff entered, pounding mightily 3 times upon the floor. He announced in a booming voice, "His Royal Majesty, King George III, Her Royal Highness, Queen Charlotte." And into the room bounded this huge man wearing a bright yellow silk waistcoat all covered with food, his wig askew, and behind him waddled a dumpling of a woman. I curtsied, John bowed, and then the king came up very close to John, and in a very heavy German accent said, "How do you do?" Before John could reply, the king had turned on his heel, leaving the room with the dumpling waddling behind him. That was our audience with the greatest monarch on earth. But soon we would return to America, and I hoped, to the Adams farm. But 1788, the first presidential election loomed before us. Oh, John so coveted the position to be the first president of the new nation. But that honor would go to the General George Washington, perhaps rightfully so. He had done so much for the new nation. John was given the position of the vice presidency. He thought he would be quite busy in the position as president of the Senate until he found out that his major job within the Senate was to keep the senators from bashing one another with their walking sticks. Oh, time would fly by. There was so much to do. And then, in September of 1796, after 2 terms in office, President Washington announced that he would not be seeking a 3rd term in the presidency. He wished to return to Mount Vernon. He had so richly deserved the retirement. And John thought, at last, I will be the president. And in November of 1796, my Mr. John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States, and I became Mrs. President. What a delight! I could not believe that John was indeed the president. I could not attend his inauguration. I was much too ill with a fever, unfit for travel. But he wrote to me, about the parades and the flag waving, the elegant parties and dinners. And he begged me Please, my dearest devoted friend, come to me. I am so in need of your counsel. The days are treacherous. But most of all, I miss you at night. I miss your tender touch, your sweet embrace. Oh, please come to me. I need you. I wrote back to John. I am very surprised to hear that a man well past 60 has such fire in his blood. He wrote back to me, my dearest devoted friend, if I had you here with me right now, I would show you that I am not yet a man of 20. That spring, I was able to travel to New York. You see, the government had rented a small house for the use of the Washingtons, and they had stayed there, but upon their leaving, they had taken all of their personal items, and what was left, the public came in and stole or smashed. Fortunately, I brought many items from the farm that I might furnish the home for the president and myself. Oh, what a time it was. My first duty as Mrs. President was to clean the house. Our time in New York would be short. For you see, a new capital had been selected. The new capital of Washington City. The wise men of government had selected a site on the banks of the Potomac River in a swamp. The first time I laid eyes on Washington City, it was a sea of mud. Why, the mud was so deep that many people said they had lost horses and small children. When I first saw the president's new house, it was a nondescript pink block building with boards running up to the front door, straw strewn within the rooms. The plaster was still wet. We had to keep all 13 fireplaces constantly stoked in order to dry the plaster. There was no staircase to the second floor, rendering the second floor useless. There was a large room on the east side of the building. The architect grandly called it the East Room. Well, it was on the east side of the building. I did not know what to do with such a grand space. I decided that I would hang the president's laundry there. I did not feel that the entire populace of Washington City should see the president's undergarments. Oh, but again, our time would be very, very short. For just months before, we had received word of the greatest weight. The General George Washington had breathed his last. Oh, how fitting that a man of such grandeur, such stature, should close out an entire century. The following January, I braved the winter roads. I traveled to Mount Vernon to pay my respects to the Lady Washington. She had always been so kind and generous to me. I feared following in her footsteps. I was not a lady trained to such grand entertainments as the Lady Washington. But again, she proved her kindness and generosity to me. Upon my leaving, she filled 14 cartloads with the finest fruits and vegetables, smoked meats, fish, wines, and the finest whiskey. The Lady Washington is the finest distiller in all of Virginia. And she gave me one additional gift. A young man, a young black man by the name of James, aged 14 years. I thought he was a traveling companion. He was a slave. The Lady Washington noted that The boy was very quick of wit, rarely needing the rod brought to his back. When I returned, I enrolled the young man in a school. When the Lady Washington heard of his enrollment, she wrote to me, asking that I remove James from the school immediately. You see, she was a founder of the school. She supported it financially. If I did not remove James from the school, she would stop all financial aid. I removed James immediately. I enrolled him in another school. That young man became a very successful shoemaker in Boston town. I think if we do not address this issue of slavery in our new nation, that it might well be our undoing. Well, again, we shall see. Another presidential election was ahead. Mr. Thomas Jefferson had decided to challenge Mr. Adams for the presidency in the year 1800. I never thought that I would live to see such a day when two men who were closer than brothers. During the Continental Congress, many said that Mr. Adams could begin a sentence and Mr. Jefferson end it. And now, Mr. Jefferson wrote scurrilous essays and letters calling Mr. Adams nothing more than a bald, toothless old man who does not deserve to be president. Such vitriol, such hatred. And Mr. Adams, he said that if he saw Mr. Jefferson coming down the street, that he would trod to the other side rather than tip his hat to the scoundrel. Well, you see, my dear Mr. Adams was in a very difficult position. On the one hand, you had the General George Washington, 6 feet 2 inches and every inch a god of war. And on the other hand, you had the red-haired Adonis, the elegant, eloquent Mr. Jefferson. And in the middle, you have my square, squat John. Well, Mr. Jefferson would prove successful in that presidential election. The contest was thrown into the Congress. Mr. Jefferson won out. And that scoundrel, Aaron Burr, became the vice president. My Mr. Adams came in a poor third. That last night in the president's house, Mr. Adams could not sleep. He stayed up all night, sorting papers, signing papers, burning papers. He could not reconcile himself that he had lost the presidency to Mr. Jefferson. But I thought, at last, we will return to the Adams farm. Oh, the place of my greatest joy and happiness. But Mr. Adams, when we returned here for the first 2 weeks, he could not remove himself from his bed. He lay upon his bed facing the wall. It was our own dear Nabby who coaxed her papa from his bed. But he is still depressed and unhappy. I have received word that I must soon travel to Albany. My daughter Nabby has been diagnosed with a cancer. I wish to bring her to Boston, and perhaps the physicians trained by Dr. Benjamin Rush might examine her. Oh, her husband has left her again. He was a ne'er-do-well, a dreamer. I shall bring her back to the farm and care for her. Oh, I do apologize. I have grown somewhat morose. And I also must apologize for the president's absence. You see, Mr. Adams refuses to believe that he is a man of 70. Just the other day, he was assisting one of our neighbors in the removal of a large boulder from a field, and I am afraid he has injured his back. He has been taken to bed these past days, but I know that he sends his best regards to each and every one, as I indeed do. And I thank you so kindly for visiting here at the Adams farm. I do hope your journey home will be a safe one. Oh, and by your leave, before you do go to the road for your journey home, would you be interested in any produce? I have some very fine apples and some lovely cherries. And also, I have some very nice fresh eggs that might avail you on your journey. Again, thank you so much for visiting here at the Adams farm. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. When I was in high school, I was very involved in the theatrics there. And I did costume design and construction and a lot of stage work. When I was a mere slip of a girl, I was offered a scholarship to the Goodman School of Theater in Chicago. And I did not accept it. I went on to school, however, and worked in healthcare, worked as a teaching assistant and lecturer at the University of Wisconsin. But there was always that nagging bit in the back of my head. I call it the marble in the tin can rolling around. I wanted to do something. I love history. I am a real nutcase when it comes to history. And I wanted the ladies' side of the story to be presented. What it was like to be involved in those campaigns, what it was like to be the spouse of the President of the United States. I began with Mary Lincoln to tell her true story. We've evolved into 3 separate programs on Mary Lincoln now. And I introduced Eleanor Roosevelt and then Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison. And each one of the ladies they're very different from one another. They're different from their backgrounds, their education, the way they viewed their position as the spouse. But they shared one thing.
What's that?
They were the First Lady.
What is the research that goes into preparing for a character?
I research, obviously, the person. I do not rely on biographies because a biographer either loves or hates his subject. I try to get as much first-person material as I can, meaning the letters that the person wrote, newspapers of the period. I also have to get a feel for the period in which they lived, because their attitudes, their ideas, their views were much different than the ones we have today. And then I also have to do clothing research so that the person is in the correct period of clothing. We're meeting Abigail today at about 1804. And so she's dressed pretty much in clothing that she would wear on a day-to-day basis when she is living on the farm. And it is a working farm.
1804. And approximately how old would Abigail have been at that time?
She would be in her 60s.
Okay. And they were on a working farm.
Right.
Give us a little bit of history about her.
Well, Abigail was married to Mr. Adams when she was just a little more than 19. She was going on 20 when they married. They would have 6 children together. They were separated for about 17 years of their married life.
Really?
And because he was off creating a country, and she was back home raising the children and minding the farm.
And in that day and age, for a woman to be doing that, that makes a very strong person.
Really, I think people forget that during that time of the American Revolution, when men had to leave the farm, and the farmers were the primary profession, one might say, at that time. It was an agrarian economy. And when these men left, somebody had to run things. You can't just let the farm go, and you have to make a living, you have to feed your family. And so it was the mothers, the daughters, the wives, the sisters, the aunts who ran it. But she was an exceptional businesswoman.
Did you find in your research about Abigail, as you said, she was an exceptional businesswoman, that she was ahead of her time?
Oh, yeah. She was definitely far and away. It was not usual for a woman to conduct business. In fact, she could not sign a contract. It was not legal. And so she put a question to Mr. Adams at one time. She asked in a letter, "Is not marriage a contract?" And he said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "If I am not able to sign a contract, then I am not married."
And that is a very forward-thinking woman at that point in time
Yes.
in history. And you think the path that she laid in history for her daughters, her grandchildren, and everything else, and that
Definitely.
she supplied to them.
I think really her letters really say it all. She had a tremendous effect on Mr. Adams' presidency and his entire life because she was a partner. She was a full-fledged partner in their marriage. He relied on her. He respected her opinion. He respected her intellect. And she was an extremely brilliant woman. When you see how she looked at issues of the day when he was the president and you read her letters, it's amazing how brilliant that woman was. She is still a very typical 18th century wife and mother. And as they progress through time and they grow in their marriage and he's gone so much, she begins really telling him, not suggesting things, but just overtly saying, "You will do this." In fact, there's a wonderful example of that. When he became president, she did not attend his inauguration because she was ill. But she wrote a list of people she felt who should be in his cabinet. And when the newspapers came out reporting who the appointees of the cabinet were, her suggestions were not there. So she wrote a letter to John, and the first line of her letter is, "Did you not get my list?" History is not a list of dates and generals who died under a tree. It is the human beings who populated that period. They made the history. They are the history.
Anything else you'd like to tell us about you and what you do?
I love what I'm doing.